Well, welcome to 10-Minute Record Reviews, episode 395. And this time I'm going to talk about this record by Conte Candoli, released on Bethlehem in 1955. Here it's a self-titled version. It's also been released as Toot Sweet, Groovin' Higher, and Powerhouse Trumpet. Conte Candoli is, of course, a trumpet player who, in terms of recorded music, is best remembered for the West Coast work that he did in the 1950s and 1960s. His best-known recordings are made with small groups, but for much of his career he actually played in big bands. He was a precocious talent, and the first time he stepped onto a stage with a big orchestra, he was still in his mid-teens. Conte was as affable and as respectful as he was talented, and that meant that the phone never stopped ringing throughout his career. He was a tremendous team player. And like all great musical team players, he makes all kinds of appearances in the studio as a sideman. Of the dozens of records he made as a leader, most of those are as a co-leader in a collaborative setting. He was very rarely the main man on a date. But this record is one of the few exceptions from 1955, his first 12-inch record as a leader. Secondo Conte Candoli was born in July 1927 in Mishawaka, Indiana, which is the eastern suburb of South Bend. His older brother, who was originally christened Walter, ends up going by the name Pete, and he becomes a trumpeter of some renown in his own right. Their parents had emigrated from Italy during the First World War. Their dad was a brass player, and he was quite active in musical circles in the Italian community in South Bend. Pete and Conte thus had access to trumpets and other kinds of brass instruments in the house, and they were encouraged by their father to pursue the trumpet. Pete was 4 years older than Conte, and when he graduated from high school in 1941, he'd become a professional musician. In the summer of 1944, he was on the cusp of joining Woody Herman's band, the famous Second Herd. At this stage, Pete had already worked with Tommy Dorsey and with Les Brown, and he'd agreed to join the Herman band, but he still owed Les Brown a couple of weeks. Herman was short a trumpeter, and so Pete recommends Conte, his younger brother, as a fill-in just for the summer. Conte is just 16 years old at the time. He takes the train from South Bend into Chicago. That night he's playing with the Herman band, and he gets a solo on Woodchopper's Ball, and instead of the usual 2 choruses for his solo, Woody gives him 5. Woody's very impressed by the young man's playing, and Conte wants to stay with the band, but Herman says, no, you got to go finish your high school, and when you come back next summer, I'll have a place for you. When he graduates in 1945, Herman was as good as his word and opened up a spot for him in the band, and Conte makes his recording debut on a track by the Herman band called Gee, It's Good to Hold You. But almost immediately, his musical career is interrupted by the draft. Conte spends a little more than a year in the Army. He's discharged in late 1946, and soon after he joins Chubby Jackson's Fifth Dimensional jazz group, which also included people like Flip Phillips and Neil Hefti. The following year, Conte joins Stan Kenton, who's leading one of a series of experimental big band groups that he organized around this time. And then in 1949, Conte moves to join Charlie Ventura. But there were a few outfits around that time that attracted the caliber of talent as the Kenton band, although he kept disbanding it and reforming it. In 1951, Conte goes back to join Kenton, and this version of the band has an incredible lineup. The other horns include people like Lee Konitz and Zoot Sims, and Stan Levy is on drums. That's an absolutely wonderful band, and there are quite a few highlights of Conte's tenure from that period, which are preserved on vinyl. One of them is a bit of a quirk. It's from a tour that Kenton took of Scandinavia in 1953. And on that tour, Conte, Frank Rosolino, Konitz, Sims, and Levy all go off to Metronome Studios to cut a few sides with the local hero, the Swedish whiz Lars Hulen. Candoli really got around when he was with Kenton. A year earlier, he'd been on a legendary live date, which features Dexter Gordon and Wardell Gray, The Chase and the Steeplechase, which was recorded live in Pasadena, presumably on another Kenton stopover. In 1954, Conte leaves the Kenton band because of a bus accident. His wife at the same time, coincidentally, has a back injury and she's pregnant, so he goes home and has basically an enforced layoff from the music world while looking after his family. Getting back in the swing of things in Chicago, at that point he forms a group with Frank Rosolino, his old friend Chubby Jackson, and the pianist Lou Levy. But just as he's about to take that band to New York, he gets a phone call from Howard Rumsey. Rumsey, of course, is a bass player, but more importantly for jazz history, he was the guy who led the long-running house band at the Lighthouse in Hermosa Beach. Conte says, I'm going to New York, and Howard says, no, you're not. You're coming out to LA, and you're playing with me. So Conte moves out to LA in late 54 or early 55. He joins the Lighthouse All-Stars. The other players in the band at the time are people like Shorty Rogers, Bob Cooper, and Bud Shank. And there he stays quite happily until 1959, even turning down Max Roach, who asked Conte to join his famous quintet after Clifford Brown had sadly been killed in that car accident in 1956. This period, the mid-1950s, is really a rich period of recording for Conte. He's on some great records as a sideman, some great classic West Coast records. Here are a few. The Herb Geller's Sextet, which has just a tremendous lineup on it. Stan Getz's somewhat tongue-in-cheek West Coast jazz record, which has really an unbeatable lineup on it. And the Shorty Rogers and Bill Holman vehicle, The Five. From 1957 to 1962, he also led a band which played every Thursday night at Dante's Supper Club, which became known as the Thursday Night Band. His brother Pete was in LA too at this point and would sometimes come and sit in. That eventually evolves into a formal setup with a band known as the Brothers Candoli. As the 50s move into the 60s, Conte also works with the Vibes player Terry Gibbs. He was in Jerry Mulligan's concert jazz band for a while. He also played with Shelly Manne, and every now and then he would pop back in to play with either Woody Herman or Stan Kenton. He was a super popular personality on the Hollywood music scene. He was on all of Frank Sinatra's TV specials. He also, beginning in 1967, began to sit in with the Tonight Show Band. Now, they were based in New York, but when they moved to Burbank in 1972, he joins Doc Severinsen and the Tonight Show Band full-time, and he stays all the way until Johnny retires in 1992. This record comes from that rich vein of recording I mentioned in the mid-1950s. It's made on the 26th of July, 1955. The engineer is Val Valentine, and the producer, although uncredited, is very likely Red Clyde, who is Bethlehem's main man out in LA and who had been the producer on Conte's original 10-inch for the label, Sincerely Conte. As for the location, it's very likely a location which was frequented by Valentine. Possibly radio recorders, but my bet would actually be the Capitol Records studio on Melrose. The Capitol Records building, the iconic one, was being constructed when this record was made. As for the lineup, it's West Coast gold. Conte is joined by Lou Levy on piano, by the tenor sax player and the great arranger, Bill Holman. Leroy Vinnegar is on bass in what is in all likelihood his debut on vinyl, and the rock-solid Larance Marable is on drums. As I mentioned, this was Conte's second record for Bethlehem. This, of course, was the first. And this one, which has got Stan Levy on drums, the great drummer, Max Bennett on bass, and Claude Williamson on piano. This is a record which, if anything, features a little bit more of the speed and range which he boasted. So much for West Coast cool. This one, I would say, is just a tad mellower, and it sees Candoli exercising a little more discretion when he plays and when he doesn't, but it still swings like a mother. Side 1 starts with Toot Sweet, which is this up-tempo number written by Holman, and both he and Conte offer fine solos. And for fans of the propulsive energy of Leroy Vinnegar's walking bass lines, that track is a must. Jazz City Blues, named for a club where they regularly gigged, is another Holman number. Conte's solo here is a masterpiece of restraint, and Vinnegar's solo is a very Leroy Vinnegar solo where he just keeps walking. The final track on side 1, My Old Flame, is the first ballad. It's a standard which was recorded by Ellington, by Basie, and by pretty much every singer after World War II. This is just a really nice version. On side 2, Full Count is a Candoli original. It's played at speed, led off by Holman's wonderfully effortless soloing. Lou Levy is great on this too. I'm Getting Sentimental Over You is a groovy mid-tempo number with a really cool percussive bridge from Marable. The second last track, 4, is of course a Miles Davis track from 1954, which by this point, just a year later, was already a standard on the West Coast. And the final track on the record is Groovin' Higher, a Candoli composition which, as the title suggests, is a tribute to Dizzy Gillespie, a musician for whom Candoli had huge respect. Conte Candoli is a musician who, like Marty Paich or Shelly Manne, raises the level of everybody when he steps into the studio, and that's very much the case here. The joke, of course, about West Coast efforts in the jazz world is that they were typically made by New York players. That's not true. You've got 2 Californians, we've got 3 Midwesterners, and they create a minor classic of the era. In any event, as any fan of West Coast jazz knows, the origins don't matter, it's the music which does. This music really swings. I think it's one of the finest records that Bethlehem put out, competes with anything else from the era, and for me, it's 4.5 out of 5 stars.